Good afternoon, BookTube. I thought I would take this opportunity to partake in something that I'm sure you're all already aware of, which is the Shakespeare Journey Tag. Now, I was actually going to do a video about my recent experience with Christopher Hitchens' book, arguably, which is a collection of his essays and articles written over the course of a decade in the literary world. But I've decided to put that on the back burner for now and to focus on Shakespeare, who, of course, is a big part of BookTube this month as part of Shaketember. And I think it is incumbent upon me to at least add my own 2 cents as to this inimitable, pervasive figure in English literature, a writer who has played a big part in my own literary journey and my own life in general, and in the lives of so many others. So let's get started. There are some prompts which I believe I have to answer, so I have copied and pasted them into a Word document, which I will be referring to over the course of this video. Now, some of these questions will be harder to answer than others, but I will try my best. So the first question is, what was your first experience reading Shakespeare, and what was it like? What was my first experience reading Shakespeare? Well, I suppose that depends on what counts as your first experience reading Shakespeare. Because, like a lot of young people who are exposed to Shakespeare, my first encounter with him was probably through those illustrated children's versions of Shakespeare that you tend to find in the library. In my case, I found those in my local library just down the road, and they were invaluable for giving me an initiation into the world of Shakespeare. I distinctly remember that there was this series of children's Shakespeare books that were very generously illustrated. I don't remember what publisher produced them. I don't remember anything about them, besides the fact that a lot of them were in my local library. And every now and again, I would pop over to this library, and I would take them out, and I would take them home, and I would devour them. And that was probably my first proper introduction to Shakespeare. I'd, of course, heard of Shakespeare. I knew of him vaguely as a presence out there in the world of literature, but I didn't properly know him like I would get to know him through these books. And I remember very well that I took out what were the plays? Hamlet was one of those plays I took out and read, not in its original form, but in this illustrated version that I found in the local library. Macbeth was one of the plays which I encountered. Romeo and Juliet was another of them. That's about all I remember. I'm sure there were more, but those are the plays which I firmly remember reading, albeit in abridged form, for the first time. And what I remember about these children's versions of Shakespeare that I read was that they would have a summary of each act or each scene, along with an excerpt of some of the most famous lines from that scene. So I remember vividly that the version of Hamlet, which I withdrew from the library, had the famous what was it? The alas poor Yorick line. Those famous lines where Hamlet is looking at the skull of Yorick, and he's having this profound meditation on the fleeting nature of life and how we all end up sooner or later in the grave. So it had this speech that Hamlet gives in the book. It obviously didn't have the whole play, but that was how I was exposed to Shakespeare for the first time. and I faintly remember taking a copy of the complete plays of Shakespeare from the library of my school and bringing it home. I don't actually recall reading it from cover to cover in any sort of religious way, but I do remember that sometime afterwards, when I still had it in my possession, I was frenziedly trying to memorize the whole of the opening soliloquy to Richard III, something which I succeeded in doing, and it is a soliloquy that I still have committed to memory to this day, and that's something I'm very proud of. So that was my first encounter with at least reading a summary of Shakespeare's plays, if not reading the whole unabridged play. My first experience reading a whole unabridged play of Shakespeare's was probably in my third year of secondary school, where we encountered Macbeth. Now, this was actually the second time that I was studying Macbeth, because in my previous secondary school, which I attended for only 1 year, in my first year of secondary school, we did actually study Macbeth, and we watched the Shakespeare animated tales version of it, which I think is marvelous. But that was my first encounter. My second encounter, however, is the one where I distinctly remember actually reading the play and actually reveling in the poetry and the beauty of the verse of Shakespeare's inimitable verse, which is so ingrained in our language now. And that was my first encounter, my first proper encounter, probably, with the language of Shakespeare and not just the narrative of his play. So that would be my answer to the first question. And what was my experience like? Well, I'm sure that you can gather, just from the way in which I'm infusing about it, that it was an experience that I will never forget. It was tremendously exciting, tremendously uplifting. It felt like I was reading this special text which had been hidden from me for all this time, and I was finally being allowed to take part in this glorious world of Shakespeare and of his poetic verse. So it was a very, very enjoyable time that I spent with the play, and it just set the pattern for my future encounters with Shakespeare and his work. So the second play is, has the reading of a Shakespeare play ever brought you to tears? What scene was it, and where were you when it happened? So I'm not a particularly emotional person, and therefore the reading of a Shakespeare play has never actually brought me to tears. There is no single Shakespeare play, and there is no single scene where I have felt even close to tears. There are definitely emotional scenes in Shakespeare, but I've never actually been on the point of tears when reading them. And that probably tells you a lot about me. Probably suggests that I'm a really stony-hearted person with very little empathy for even fictional human beings, which I would like to think isn't true. But no, I've never actually been on the brink of tears when reading Shakespeare, or indeed any book that I can think of. Number 3, are there any people that have played a significant role in your Shakespeare journey? Yes. So when I was in my first year of secondary school, year 7, my English teacher taught us Shakespeare. I believe her name was... What was her name? I've forgotten, but so she was the person who really introduced us to Shakespeare, many of us for the first time. In my case, of course, it wasn't for the first time, but it was a welcome, let's say, introduction to Shakespeare's Macbeth, which I had already read in that children's illustrated version that I was telling you about. but which of course I had only briefly encountered. So this was, if you will, a second chance to get to know Macbeth. And I remember her showing us the BBC Animated Tales adaptation of it, which is, for those of you who don't know, it was a series of adaptations, animated adaptations, that the BBC made back in the 80s, if I'm not mistaken, of Shakespeare plays, and they're tremendously good. I would recommend everyone to go out and watch them. They should be on YouTube, actually, and it was actually on YouTube that we watched that as a class. And that animated version of Shakespeare left a really big impression on me. It really made the story of Macbeth more vivid than it had been before. And that is one of the adaptations of Macbeth that is still very much imprinted on my mind when I think about the play. So that's one person who played a big role in my Shakespeare journey. The other person would be my English teacher in my third year of secondary school, when I was at that point in a different school, and I had my second encounter with Macbeth in a school setting. This time we watched the Patrick Stewart adaptation, which, for those of you who don't know, it's this absolutely fantastic adaptation that came out back in 2010, so about 14 years ago. You have the commanding presence of Patrick Stewart as the cunning Scottish noble who slaughters his way to the top and then has to keep on killing in order to maintain his throne. It is probably the best adaptation of Macbeth I have ever seen. I've not seen a version of Macbeth that beats it. It is lavishly done. The conceit of the film is that it's drawing on the 1995 Ian McKellen version of Richard III. You have all of these Scottish nobles reimagined as Soviet army officers wearing Soviet army uniforms, and medieval Scotland is reimagined as this sort of Soviet dictatorship or Eastern European dictatorship, in which everyone's walking around wearing these rather quaint uniforms, looking rather militaristic and rather intimidating, and I just think it's fantastic. So that was my second encounter with the play, and that was the first time that we actually got to read the text of Shakespeare, as I've said before. So this was a real milestone in my Shakespeare journey. And then, of course, in the succeeding year, we continued with Shakespeare. This time we were doing our exams, our what's known in the UK as our GCSE exams, and as part of that, we studied The Merchant of Venice, and I have very fond memories of actually reading that play and watching the Jeremy Irons adaptation from, I believe, 2004, which has Al Pacino as Shylock, I believe. And I have very fond memories of writing my essay on it and doing very well. I got a top grade. I got an A star in it. So that is another milestone in my Shakespeare journey. There is also my teacher in sixth form, what's known in the UK as sixth form. So between the ages of 16 to 18, before you go off to university, you have to either enroll in a sixth form or a college and do what's known as A-levels in preparation for university. So my sixth form English teacher introduced us to the wonderful world of Hamlet, which I read for the first time. And as part of that course, I also reread Macbeth and Richard III as part of an essay that we had to do as part of our qualification on a piece of literature, or two pieces of literature of our choice, and my choice was Shakespeare. So in addition to Hamlet, I wrote an essay on Macbeth and Richard III, which again I got a top grade in. So Shakespeare already at this very early stage of my life was playing a big role in terms of my literary imagination. And is there anybody else who played a big role in my Shakespeare journey? I suppose I would have to mention Patrick Stewart, as I've mentioned before, the actor Patrick Stewart, who of course did such a good job playing Macbeth in that adaptation. I'd also mention Ian McKellen and his brilliant work as playing Richard III in that 1995 adaptation, which I've watched and which is very good. Kenneth Branagh as well, his Hamlet in his, what year was this, 1996 adaptation, which, to be honest, I think he was actually overshadowed by Derek Jacobi as Claudius. I think that Jacobi outacted Kenneth Branagh. I don't love Branagh's interpretation of Hamlet, but I do recall watching it was when I was in sixth form, and it is probably the film version that sticks out the most because of the fact that it's unabridged. So I guess I should also credit him with at least giving me an impression of what it would be like to actually stage the whole play unabridged. So I would mention those actors. That's about it, really. I think I should stop there, otherwise this video will go on forever. Number 4. Do you have a favourite book or film about Shakespeare? Yes, the Patrick Stewart Macbeth adaptation. Go and watch it. It's marvellous. Number 5. Which character in Shakespeare most resembles you and in what ways? I don't feel comfortable answering this because invariably, in answering a question like this, you're revealing a lot about yourself that you probably want to keep hidden. So, do I really want to reveal this rather intimate aspect of myself by telling you all which Shakespeare character I resemble? Don't I want to keep this hidden? But if I must answer, then I would probably say Richard III. Now, before you all freak out and shut down this video, I'm not saying that I resemble Richard III in his more psychopathic tendencies, but one aspect of him that I think I can empathise with is his sense of social isolation. As someone who has always felt differently from those around him, I do empathise with Richard III to the degree that he feels a degree of isolation because of something that he can't control, which is his deformity. Of course, he can control his decisions to behave like a psychopath, and these, of course, I do not endorse, but in that sense, I would say Richard III, perhaps, is the character that comes most to mind. Either him or Macbeth, because, like Macbeth, when I was very young, I was very ambitious to go into politics and maybe become Prime Minister one day. Unlike Macbeth, however, I did not allow that ambition to lead me to murder anyone, so I suppose in that respect I am a much better person than Macbeth. So I would say either Macbeth or Richard III in terms of which Shakespeare characters I most resemble. But to be honest, there are others I could name. There are others who have an equal claim. Coriolanus, perhaps, is is a character that I'm very similar to in some ways. So those would be the characters that come to mind instantly. I don't think there's any one character. I think that there is probably more than one character that I would resemble. So that's number 5, and then question number 6: which play would you most like to see performed in a theatre and why? Probably my favourite play, which is Macbeth. Easy question there. I don't think I've ever seen it performed in the theatre, though. I've only ever seen film adaptations. I would like to see it performed on stage at some point, but I don't know when that will be. And tickets to the theatre aren't exactly cheap, so we'll see when I'm able to do that, hopefully at some point soon. Number 7. Which actor throughout history would you most like to have seen play Hamlet while in his prime? Probably Peter O'Toole, because he is my favourite actor of all time, and I just think it would have been spellbinding to see him play Hamlet. He didn't always cover himself in glory when playing Shakespeare. He did a famously terrible version of Macbeth that actually was so bad people queued up to watch it because of how terrible it was, and it actually saved the theatre from bankruptcy, ironically enough. But I would definitely have loved to see Peter O'Toole playing Hamlet. I would mention Laurence Olivier, but he already did in fact play Hamlet in a film adaptation, which I haven't actually seen, so I should probably go and watch it at some point. But Peter O'Toole would be my answer to that. 8. Deliver your favourite speech or soliloquy from a Shakespeare play. That would be easy. I'm going to deliver the opening soliloquy of Richard III, which I memorised when I was a teenager. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by the sun of York, and o'er the clouds that loud upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. Now are our brows bound with victorious wreaths, our bruised arms hung up for monuments, our stern alarums changed to merry meetings, our dreadful marches to delightful measures. Grim-visaged war hath smoothed her wrinkled front, and now, instead of mounting barbed steeds to fright the souls of fearful adversaries, he capers nimbly in a lady's chamber, to the lascivious pleasing of a lute. But I, that am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor wont to court an amorous looking-glass, I that am rudely stamped, and want love's majesty to strut before a wanton ambling nymph, I that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable, the dogs bark at me as I halt by them. Why, I, in this weak, piping time of peace, with no delight to pass away the time, except to spy my shadow in the sun, and descant on mine own deformity. And as I cannot prove a lover, to entertain these fair, well-spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain, and hate the idle pleasures of these days. Dark plots have I laid, inductions dangerous, by drunken prophecies, libels, and dreams, to set my brother Clarence and the king in deadly hate, the one against the other. And if King Edward be as true and just as I am subtle, false, and treacherous, this day should Clarence be closely mewed up about a prophecy that says that G of Edward's heirs the murderer shall be. Dive thoughts down to my soul. Here Clarence comes. That is the opening soliloquy that I memorized so lovingly and so diligently when I was a young lad. Number 9. Do any of Shakespeare's plays intimidate you? If yes, what play and why? King Lear, because I've heard it so emotional. So I think I will take my time before getting to it. Number 10. What tips would you give to intimidated readers coming to Shakespeare for the first time? Watch a good adaptation of the play. I can't stress enough how much watching 2 very good adaptations of Macbeth opened up for me the world of that play. The BBC animated Shakespeare Tales version, which is really good, and the Macbeth film with Patrick Stewart, which is fantastic. You have a brilliant cast. Patrick Stewart as this commanding, charismatic Scottish noble who goes on to become king. You have a very, very good supporting cast. The actress who plays his spouse, Lady Macbeth, whose name I've temporarily forgotten, Catherine Fleetwood, I believe it is. She is also absolutely brilliant. The other actors are also very good. The setting, the stage is The staging of it is what I meant to say, is also really good. The cinematography is also marvelous. Just go and watch it. I can't stress enough how important it is to watch a good adaptation of a Shakespeare play, because these plays were meant to be performed, not just read. And also make sure that any version you get is one with plenty of notes. So this Arden copy of Richard III that I have here, like any good copy of a Shakespeare play, has generous notes in the margins, or in this case, at the bottom, explaining difficult words, because Shakespeare was, of course, using an antiquated version of English, which isn't too far removed from our own, but is still removed enough that it's difficult a lot of the time to understand it. And don't be too put off by the difficult language, because if you focus on those bits that you do understand, you'll actually realize that Shakespeare isn't as hard as you might imagine. And of course, as I've said before, if you have good notes, they should explain those difficult bits of the play you don't quite get. But that is the advice I would give to anyone struggling with Shakespeare. Number 11, which is your favourite Shakespeare play and why? Macbeth, because I believe that it is his greatest drama, his most controlled drama. I just think that if you compare it to something like Hamlet, which is this sprawling masterpiece that is very difficult to actually stage and perform, Macbeth wins when it comes to the control that Shakespeare exerts over the narrative, and the sheer explosive quality of the drama, of the stage drama, and the complexity of the characters. Macbeth himself, but also Lady Macbeth, is a really interesting, complex character in her own right, and it's for good reason that she has been the focus of so much scholarship, because she is such a strong, impressive character in her own right. Banquo is also an interesting character. Even the rather hapless, rather mild-mannered King Duncan is a somewhat interesting figure. And not just King Duncan, but even his son Malcolm, he is also a very interesting figure in his own right. So this combination of a compelling narrative, of course you have the witches and this whole supernatural subplot added to the mix, which just makes it riveting reading. But you also have these complex characters which are worthy of study in their own right, and it's a very short play. It's his shortest play, so you can read it in one afternoon. You can watch it performed in one sitting, and you can get the power of the play coming straight for you in that really nice concentrated form. So I would say Macbeth is my favourite. And now we come to number 12, which is Tag Other Booktubers. I will probably tag Joe Spivey. I don't know of any other booktubers that I watch avidly that haven't done the Shakespeare Journey Tag. I don't believe that Joe Spivey has, so I will probably tag him, but if he has done it already, then I send my apologies. So I think that is going to be the end of what has been a rather long video of about half an hour, which is my longest video so far, uploaded on this channel. So I think I will leave it there, and I will see you all very shortly.